They didn't just throw her out, they made sure the whole street was watching. 8 months pregnant, no money, no phone, standing in the middle of a thunderstorm while her mother-in-law poured her clothes into the gutter. She begged. She got down on her knees in the mud and begged, and they recorded it. They actually recorded a pregnant woman on her knees and posted it online. But what nobody recorded was what happened 16 years later, when that same child walked back to that house, holding something that made every single person inside go silent. The rain that night was the kind that punishes. It didn't fall, it attacked. And right there on Okonkwo Street, in a small city just outside Lagos, a pregnant woman named Adaize was standing barefoot in the mud while her entire world collapsed. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Izenwa, stood under the porch with her arms crossed, watching like she was enjoying a performance. Behind her, 2 house girls peeked through the curtain but said nothing. The gateman looked at the ground. Nobody in that compound had the courage to speak. Adaize's suitcase was already in the gutter. Her wrapper was soaked through, clinging to her swollen belly. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that her husband, Obinna, was standing right there at the upstairs window. He could see everything. He could hear her crying his name. And he didn't come down. He didn't shout. He didn't even close the window. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, like a man watching something that had nothing to do with him. Neighbors opened their windows, looked out, then closed them again. One woman across the street started to walk toward Adaize with an umbrella, but her husband pulled her back inside and locked the door. That's the kind of power the Ezenwa name carried on that street. Even compassion was afraid of it. Mrs. Ezenwa had told the entire street a lie. She said the baby in Adaize's belly was not Obinna's. She said Adaize had been sleeping with a trader from the motor park, a man named Chidi who sold phone accessories. She described the affair in detail, dates and times and locations, like she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. None of it was true, not even close. Adaize had never spoken more than 10 words to that trader in her life. But Mrs. Ezenwa didn't need the truth. She just needed the street to believe her. And in that part of the city, when a rich woman points at a poor girl and calls her a liar, nobody asks for proof. They just nod. They whisper behind their gates. And they move on. Because it's easier to agree with money than to stand with the truth. But the humiliation didn't end there. Kainene, Obinna's younger sister, pulled out her phone while Adaize was kneeling in the mud. She recorded everything. The tears on Adaize's face, the mud staining her dress, the swollen belly shaking with each sob, and she narrated it too. "This is what you get," Kainene said behind the camera, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She posted the video on Facebook with the caption, "This is what happens when you bring shame to a good family." Within 2 hours, the video had been shared over 400 times. By the next morning, it had passed 1,000. Adaize's face was everywhere, on WhatsApp groups, on blogs, on strangers' phones. And in that video, not a single person tried to help her. Not one hand reached out. The whole street just watched a pregnant woman crawl. Adaize walked for nearly an hour in that storm. She had nowhere to go. Her parents were dead. Her only brother lived in Enugu and hadn't spoken to her since she married Obinna. She had no phone to call anyone, no money for a bus, just her body, her baby, and the rain. When her legs finally gave out, she collapsed near a motor park on the edge of town, behind a row of parked trucks. The pain was sharp and low. The baby was pressing down. She held her belly with both hands and whispered, "Not yet, please, not yet." Around her neck, her father's wooden pendant, a small piece of carved Iroko wood on a leather string, pressed against her chest. Her father had made it before he died, and told her it carried the strength of their family. Tonight, That pendant was the only thing in the world she still owned. She pressed it against her lips and whispered her father's name. The trucks around her rumbled in the wind. Somewhere in the distance a dog was barking, and Adais lay there, alone in the dark, wondering if this was how her story would end. A woman nobody remembered, bleeding behind a row of trucks in a city that didn't care. A mechanic named Tunde found her. He'd been locking up his workshop across the road when he heard a woman moaning behind the trucks. Most men in that area would have walked past. It was late, the rain was heavy, and a woman lying on the ground near a motor park at night was not the kind of situation most people wanted to touch. But Tunde was not most people. He was a quiet man who fixed engines for a living and minded his own business. But he had a principle he never broke. If someone is suffering and you can help, you help. He knelt beside her, saw the belly, saw the blood starting to stain her dress, and he didn't waste a second. He lifted her gently into the back of his old pickup truck and drove to the nearest clinic. The nurse at the desk looked at Adaiza, soaked, bleeding, no ID, no money, and almost waved them away. Tunde pulled out every naira he had earned that week, slapped it on the counter and said, "Save this woman first. We'll sort the rest later." Adais gave birth that night to a boy. She named him Chukwuemeka, meaning God has done something great. And even though she was lying on the cheapest bed in the smallest clinic in the city, holding a baby she couldn't even afford to feed, she whispered that name into his ear over and over, like it was a prayer and a promise wrapped into one. She untied the wooden pendant from her own neck and gently knotted it around the baby's tiny wrist with a piece of thread the nurse gave her. Her hands were shaking. Her body was broken, but her eyes were steady. She didn't know where she would sleep tomorrow. She didn't know how she would eat. But she made a vow in that clinic bed that she would die before she let this world do to her son what it had done to her. Tunde let Adaize stay in the back room of his mechanic workshop. It wasn't much. A thin mattress on a concrete floor, a single bulb hanging from a wire, and a curtain separating the room from the shop. The air smelled like engine oil and rust, but it was dry. It was safe. And for the first time in weeks, Adaize slept without fear. She started helping around the shop to earn her keep, washing the greasy rags, sweeping the concrete floor, cooking jollof rice and pepper soup for Tunde and his 2 apprentices. Within a month, she started frying akara and puff-puff in the mornings, selling them from a small table at the motor park entrance. Bus drivers and Okada riders became her first regular customers. The money was small, the work was hard, but Adaize treated it like it was the most important job in the world, because for her, it was. It was survival. But then the video caught up with her. One morning, a market woman named Neka walked right up to Adaize's frying spot, looked her up and down, and said loud enough for the whole row to hear, "You're that woman from the video, Abi, the one they threw out for sleeping around?" Adaize's hands froze over the hot oil. She didn't even have time to respond before Neka turned to the other traders and announced, "I don't want this kind of woman selling near my stall. She'll bring bad luck to all of us." The effect was instant. Traders who had been buying her puff-puff every morning suddenly couldn't look at her. Women who had smiled at her the day before now walked past without a word. Within 3 days, her customer base was cut in half. The video didn't just follow Adaize. It became her shadow, her reputation, her prison. Everywhere she went, it got there first. But Adaize didn't fold. She moved her frying table to the far end of the motor park, closer to the long-distance buses where people didn't recognize her face. She started waking up at 4 in the morning to secure the best position. She carried baby Emeka strapped to her back while she worked over the open flame. Her hands cracked from the heat. Her feet swelled from standing on concrete from dawn to dark. Some nights she was so tired she could barely lift the baby off her back. But every single night, After she counted her small earnings and looked at Emeka, sleeping on the mat beside her, she whispered the same words to herself. "This is not forever, this is just for now." Those words kept her alive. Those words kept her standing when every part of her body begged to lie down. She would look at Emeka's sleeping face and see her father's jawline already forming. She would see the pendant resting against his little chest and think, "This boy will not grow up wondering if he is loved. He will know it. He will feel it every single day, because I will make sure of it, even if it kills me." But Mrs. Ezenwa was watching. Even from across the city, she had eyes on Adais. A relative had mentioned seeing Adais at the motor park, looking healthy, selling food, surviving. And the one thing that woman could not tolerate was Adais surviving. It wasn't enough to throw her out. It wasn't enough to humiliate her in front of the street. Mrs. Ezenwa needed Adais to be destroyed completely, so she sent Kainin. Kainin went to the area where Adais lived and worked, moving from stall to stall, shop to shop, whispering a new lie. She told people Adais was a thief, that she had stolen gold jewelry from the Ezenwa house before she left, that the police were looking for her. She even showed people a fake police report she had typed up on her laptop. None of it was real, but by the end of the week, Adai's last remaining customers had stopped coming. The woman who rented her the small room behind the motor park told her she had 24 hours to leave. And just like that, Adais was back on the street, with a baby on her back and nothing in her hands. She found shelter in an uncompleted building on the edge of the expressway. No doors, no windows, just bare concrete walls and a zinc roof full of holes. She spread her mat in the driest corner and lay there with Emeka pressed against her chest, listening to the rain drip through the ceiling. The wooden pendant was still tied around the boy's wrist. That night, for the first time in weeks, Adais cried, not soft tears, deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere she couldn't control. She wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because she was furious, furious at how easy it was for people with money to destroy a life. Furious at Obina for standing at that window like a statue. Furious at a world that let a pregnant woman crawl in the mud and turned it into entertainment. And she was furious at herself, forever believing the Ezenwa family had cared about her. Tunde found her again. When she disappeared from the motor park, he spent 3 days asking around. A bus conductor finally told him about a woman with a baby living in the uncompleted building near the expressway toll gate. Tunde showed up with 2 bags of rice, a jerry can of kerosene, a small stove, and a plastic basin for washing. He didn't give a speech. He didn't make promises. He didn't even say much at all. He just set the things down on the floor, looked at her and said, "The room at the shop is still open, whenever you're ready." Adais looked at this man, this quiet, oil-stained mechanic who had nothing to gain from helping her, and something inside her shifted. She tied Emeka to her back, gathered her things, and followed Tunde to his truck. Sometimes people don't save you with grand gestures or big speeches. Sometimes they save you by simply showing up when everyone else has walked away. 3 years passed. Adais had turned her roadside frying operation into a proper catering business. She cooked for motor park drivers, construction crews, office workers, and security guards at nearby compounds. She had 2 young girls helping her. She rented a real apartment now, 1 room and a kitchen with a proper door that locked. It wasn't luxury, but it was hers. Emeka was growing fast. He could count to 100 before he learned to write his full name. He asked questions that made adults pause and scratch their heads. Adais enrolled him in the local public school, and by his 2nd term, his teacher pulled her aside and said, "Madam, your son is not like the other children. This boy sees things differently." Every morning before school, Emeka would hold the wooden pendant in his small hands and ask, "Mama, what does this mean?" And every morning, Adaz would say the same thing. "It's your grandfather's strength. One day, you'll understand." She never told him about the Ezenwas. She never poisoned his mind with bitterness. She let him grow in sunlight, even though she herself had been raised in storms. But Mrs. Ezenwas still wasn't finished. When she heard through a cousin that Adaz was doing well, that she had an apartment, a growing business, a son in school, something dark and ugly twisted inside her chest. She could not accept that Adaz was rising, so she called in a favor. She contacted a landlord in Adaz's area, a man who owed the Ezenwa family money, and told him to cancel Adaz's lease. No reason, no warning. The landlord showed up at Adaz's door one evening and told her she had 48 hours to pack and leave. He wouldn't explain. He wouldn't refund the 3 months of rent she had already paid. Adazi stood in that doorway holding Emeka's hand, and she knew, she could feel it in her bones, exactly who was behind this. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She packed her things that night, found a cheaper room in a rougher part of town, and started rebuilding again. But something had changed inside her. The last traces of softness were gone. What remained was iron. Pure, unbreakable iron. Stay with this story, because the moment that changes everything is almost here. And it starts with a scholarship, a hidden envelope, and a truth that's been buried for 16 years. 12 more years passed. Emeka was 15 now, tall, quiet, serious. He wore his grandfather's wooden pendant around his neck every day, and he never took it off. Not for sports, not for bathing, not for anything. He was the top student at his public school, not just in his class, but in the entire school. His science teacher, Mr. Okafor, pulled Ades aside one afternoon and told her something she already suspected, but needed to hear from someone else. "Your son's mind doesn't work like other children's. He doesn't memorize. He understands. He sees patterns and systems where other students see confusion." When a national scholarship competition was announced, the Adekunle Foundation Prize, which would send one student to study engineering at the top university in the country, with full funding, housing, and a monthly stipend, Mr. Okafor submitted Emeka's name without hesitation. There was just one problem. Kanin's son, Dubam, was also in the competition. Dubam attended one of the most expensive private schools in Lagos. He had private tutors in mathematics and physics. He had a laptop. He had a study room with air conditioning and bookshelves that reached the ceiling. He had every advantage that money could buy. And Mrs. Ezenwa had already been telling everyone in her circle that Dubam would win. She had donated money to the competition's organizing committee. She had made phone calls to board members. She had done what she always did, tried to buy the result before the contest even started. But when she found out that Emeka, the child she had called a bastard 16 years ago, was competing in the same scholarship, something inside her cracked like dry glass. This time Mrs. Ezenwa didn't go after the scholarship. She went straight for Adeze. She picked up her phone and called the child welfare office. She filed an anonymous report claiming that Adeze was an unfit mother. She said Emeka was being neglected. She said the boy was living in unsafe conditions with no proper food, no supervision, and no family support. 2 days later, a social worker arrived at Adeze's apartment with a clipboard and a stern expression. They inspected the room. They opened the kitchen cabinets. They questioned Emeka at school. They interviewed the neighbors. For 3 agonizing weeks, Adeze lived in a state of constant terror that they would take her son away from her. She couldn't eat. She barely slept. Every knock on the door made her heart stop. And the cruelest part of all was that the report was anonymous. She couldn't even face her accuser. She just had to stand there and let strangers decide if she was a good enough mother for the child she had carried through hell. Every night during those 3 weeks, she sat beside Emeka's bed while he slept and watched his chest rise and fall. She counted his breaths. She memorized his face, because some part of her believed that any morning someone would knock on the door and take him away. And if that happened, she wanted to remember everything. The investigation cleared her completely. The social worker's final report said Emeka was well-nourished, emotionally stable, academically exceptional, and deeply loved by his mother. There was no evidence of neglect. There was no evidence of danger. The case was closed, but the damage was already done. Adaz had missed nearly 3 weeks of catering orders during the investigation because she was afraid to leave the house. Several of her regular clients had moved on to other caterers. The money she had saved was running low again, and Emeka, 15 years old now, tall and observant and far too perceptive for his own peace of mind, sat on his bed one night and asked his mother a question she had been dreading since the day he learned to talk. "Mama," he said, his voice quiet and steady, "who is my father, and why does someone keep trying to hurt us?" Adazi sat down beside him and told him everything, not all at once, not in anger, but slowly, carefully, piece by piece, like peeling a bandage off a wound that had never fully healed. She told him about the Ezenwa house, about the night she was thrown into the rain, about the video, about the lies, the evictions, the whispers, the sabotage that had followed her for 16 years. Emeka listened without interrupting. His face didn't change. His hands were still. When she finished, he reached up and held the wooden pendant around his neck, rubbing the smooth Iroko wood between his thumb and finger. He looked at his mother for a long time, and then he said, so quietly it was almost a whisper, "You carried me through all of that?" Adaz nodded. Emeka swallowed hard, then said something that broke her heart and rebuilt it at the same time. "Then I'm going to carry us from here." The following week, Tunde came to see Adaz with something he had been holding for years. It was an old brown envelope, wrinkled, water-stained, soft at the edges from age. He explained that he had found it the night he rescued her at the motor park, tucked deep inside the leather pouch that held her father's pendant. The pouch had a hidden fold sewn into the lining, and the envelope had been pressed so flat inside it that it looked like part of the stitching. He hadn't noticed it for months, and by the time he did, Adaz was already fighting so hard just to survive that he didn't want to hand her another unknown, another worry, another thing to carry, so he kept it safe. He put it in a metal box under his workbench, and he waited. He waited until the time was right, and now finally he was handing it to her. Inside the envelope were 2 items. The first was a handwritten letter from Adaz's father. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. He wrote that he had always known his daughter would face difficult times because the world is cruel to women who have no family behind them, so he had left her something. The second item was a certified land title document, registered in her father's name, covering a large plot of land on the eastern edge of the city. 16 years ago, that land had been bush, overgrown, unfenced, barely worth anything. But now? Now it sat in the direct center of a massive new commercial development zone. Roads had been paved through it. Shopping complexes had been built around it. Luxury apartment towers had gone up on neighboring plots. That land was now worth more money than Adaz had seen in her entire life combined. But that wasn't even the biggest revelation. The biggest revelation was this. The southern corner of that plot, about a quarter of the total land, already had a building on it. A big, expensive house. The Ezenwa family house. They had been living on her father's land the entire time. Adazi stared at the document for a very long time. She read it once, then again, then a third time. Then she looked up at Tunde with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not joy, but something ancient and calm and terrifying. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that they built their house on my father's land?" Tunde nodded. He had already gone to the land registry office to verify everything. The records showed that the Ezenwa family had obtained their building permit using forged ownership documents. Mrs. Ezenwa's late husband had fabricated the papers more than a decade ago, back when the land was worthless bush and nobody was paying attention. But the land had always belonged to Adese's father, and now, by inheritance, every square meter of it belonged to Adese. Adese didn't rush. She didn't scream. She didn't run to the Ezenwa house waving papers. She did what iron does. She moved slowly, and she moved with devastating weight. She contacted a women's legal advocacy organization she had heard about on the radio. They reviewed the documents. They verified the land title independently. They confirmed the forgery. And then they filed a formal case with the court. A real case, with real evidence, with real lawyers. And when the court summons was delivered to the front door of the Ezenwa house on Okonkwo Street, the same street where Adasi had once crawled in the mud, the neighbors heard Mrs. Ezenwa scream so loudly that the gateman came running from the back of the compound, thinking someone had died. But before the court date, something extraordinary happened. The Adekunle Foundation prize results came out. Emeka had won, and he hadn't just won. He had won by the widest margin in the competition's 12-year history. His engineering proposal was so original and so advanced that one of the judges, a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Lagos, called it the most impressive student submission he had seen in 2 decades of academic life. The proposal was about clean water filtration systems for low-income communities, a problem Emeka had watched his mother struggle with for years. Dubem, Kanin's son, with all his private tutors and air-conditioned study rooms, placed 9th. When the results were published in the newspaper and online, people started connecting the dots. Someone found the old video. Someone remembered the pregnant woman in the rain. And now they saw her son standing on a stage, in a pressed white shirt and clean trousers, holding a scholarship certificate and wearing a small wooden pendant around his neck. The same child, the same pendant. 16 years later, someone wrote online, "This is the boy they threw into the rain. Look at him now." That post alone was shared over 10,000 times in 2 days. Adese saw it on someone's phone at the market. She didn't say anything. She just smiled. A small, private smile that held 16 years of pain and pride all at once. The internet did what the internet always does. The old video went viral a second time, but this time the comments were different. Nobody was laughing at Adaz anymore. People were calling her a warrior, a lion, a queen. They were calling Mrs. Ezenwa a monster. Screenshots of Kanin's original Facebook post were dug up and shared side by side with Emeka's scholarship photograph. The whole story unraveled in front of the entire country. Journalists picked it up. Bloggers wrote about it. Radio stations discussed it. And when the land fraud case went to court 2 weeks later, every major news outlet in Lagos sent reporters. Mrs. Ezenwa and Kanin were formally charged with conspiracy, land fraud, and forgery of government documents. The house they had lived in for over a decade, the same house they had thrown a pregnant woman out of during a thunderstorm, had been built on stolen land, land that legally, rightfully, and irrevocably belonged to the woman they had tried to erase. Obinna tried to reach Adaize. He called. She didn't answer. He sent messages through people. She didn't respond. He even showed up at her apartment one evening, standing outside in a light drizzle, waiting. And the irony of that image, him standing in the rain outside her door, just like she had once stood in the rain outside his, was not lost on anyone who saw it. Through the window, he told her he was sorry. He told her he had been weak. He told her he should have walked down those stairs 16 years ago. He said he had thought about it every single day since. Adazi stood on the other side of the curtain, listening. She let him finish. Then, without a word, she closed the curtain. She didn't owe that man a single syllable, and she gave him nothing. Because some apologies come too late. Some words can never undo what silence already did. And Adazi had spent 16 years learning how to live without the man who was supposed to protect her. She didn't need his regret. She had already built her own redemption. If this story touched something inside you, drop a comment and tell us which moment hit you the hardest. And make sure you're subscribed, because our next story is going to shatter your heart and put it back together piece by piece. Tunde was there the day the court ruled in Adazi's favor. He sat in the back row of the courtroom wearing a clean shirt he had ironed himself that morning. He didn't sit in the front. He didn't stand up and cheer when the verdict was read. He just sat there, hands on his knees, watching with a quiet pride that filled the room more than any applause could. This was the man who had carried rice to a woman sleeping in an uncompleted building. The man who had searched for 3 days when she disappeared. The man who had kept an old envelope safe for over a decade without asking for recognition or reward. After the verdict, as they walked down the courthouse steps together, Tunde did something he had never done before. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, not with a speech. He just reached over and held it. Adazi didn't pull away. She held on tight, and in that moment, standing on those courthouse steps, she felt something she had almost forgotten was real. Safety. True, unshakable, earned safety. The Ezenwa family was ordered to vacate the property within 90 days. Mrs. Ezenwa, who had spent her entire life looking down at other people from the height of her money and her lies, now had every eye in the city looking down at her. Kanine deleted all her social media accounts within hours of the verdict. Dubam transferred to a school in another state because students at his old school kept sending him screenshots of his grandmother throwing a pregnant woman into the rain. The empire that family had built on cruelty, deception, and forged documents was crumbling from every direction at once. And the woman they had called a disgrace, the woman they had filmed on her knees, she was the one still standing. She was the one holding the deed. She was the one who owned the ground beneath their feet. Mrs. Ezenwa was seen leaving the courthouse that day in the same wrapper she used to wear when she went to the market. No driver, no jewelry, no entourage. Just a tired old woman walking alone to a bus stop she had never used before. The street that had once feared her name now whispered it with pity. And pity for a woman like Mrs. Ezenwa was worse than hatred. Adazi used the land to build something that neighborhood had never seen before. A women's empowerment and skills center. A place where women who had been abandoned, betrayed, cheated, thrown out, could come and learn a trade that would give them a life. Catering, tailoring, hairdressing, small business management. She named the center after her father, and on the front wall, carved into a wooden plaque made from the same Iroko wood as her pendant, were the words, "What they threw away, God picked up." Tunde managed the building's maintenance without being asked and without asking for a title. He just showed up every morning with his tools. But everybody in that neighborhood knew the truth about that man. He had loved Adazi when she had nothing, no money, no name, no address. And he loved her exactly the same way now, not louder, not different, the same. And Emeka? That boy stood in front of the old Ezenwa house one last time. The moving trucks were pulling away. The compound was empty. The gate was open. He didn't go inside. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't shout or celebrate or gloat. He stood there quietly with the wooden pendant in his hand. The same pendant his mother had tied around his wrist the night he was born in a clinic she couldn't afford. He looked at that house for a long, still moment. The house where his mother had been humiliated in front of the world. The house where his father had stood at the window and chosen silence. The house that was built on land that had always belonged to his family. Then Chukwuemeka turned around, and he walked away. The pendant caught the afternoon sunlight as he moved. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Everything he needed was ahead of him. His mother, his future, the man who had shown him what quiet love looked like, and a pendant made of Iroko wood that had traveled from his grandfather's hands to his mother's neck to his own chest, carrying a strength that no amount of money could buy, no amount of cruelty could break, and no amount of rain could wash away.